Good evening, everybody, and Shalom Aleichem. Welcome and thank you so much for joining me for the next installment in our series of Lishmoa El Arina V'El Tefillah, experiencing Tishrei through the music of Torah. I'd like to begin this evening once again thanking our generous sponsors, Rachel and Chaim Mandelbaum and family, who have sponsored this entire series in memory of Lorraine Vogel, Liba Devora, Bas Aaron, Shimon, Aleha Shalom. We thank them very much. So we find ourselves right now at the next stage and phase in our conversation, and of course closer to the holy day of Yom HaKippurim. And this evening, what we are going to do is we are going to analyze the song which is called Seder HaAvoda, and I've called tonight's shir "Following the Footsteps of the Kohen Gadol." Now, I'm sure I'm not the only one who will begin tonight's conversation by saying that for me, this song is different, if you will, because this is sort of where it all started. I have said about Yishai Ribo's songs in the conversations that we'd have over the past couple of weeks that the interpretations that we have of his songs, the takeaways that we choose to take from the songs, that they are personal. And this is always true, but I think it's particularly true regarding this song. Obviously, the timing of the song, in terms of our studying it several days before Yom HaKippurim, makes it all the more relevant and potentially emotionally impactful. But I know that many people have listened to this song all throughout the year, in the dead of the winter, in the middle of the spring, when Yom Kippur was farthest from our mind, but yet it has a very, very powerful and has made a very powerful impression upon many, many people. You can't necessarily draw absolute conclusions based on the number of hits that a song has on YouTube. But the fact that there are millions and millions of views on YouTube with this song, and that there are beautiful videos that I've seen of concerts all over the world, particularly in Eretz Yisrael, and we see many, many people of all different shades and all different stripes and colors who sing the words to the song with such a deep sense of enthusiasm and genuine connection to the words, to the concept, to the meaning, to the experience of Avodas Yom HaKippurim, is something that I know many of us have found very powerful and truly very inspiring. So what we're going to do tonight, tonight's shir is actually going to be a little different than the previous two and probably the next two, but we're going to start the way we always have, and that is that we're going to play the song. Now, it's not a very long song, but it's not a particularly short one. I think it's a little less than 6 minutes, and there's a lot to process and digest. It is a very dense song, as I've been doing until now. The lyrics will be posted both in Hebrew and in English, and even for those of us who are familiar with the lyrics, I'm hoping that when we have a chance to sort of read them along the way, it will help us focus a little more. So I'm going to put the lyrics up as we start, and we will continue our conversation after the song is complete.
נכנס למקום שנכנס ועמד במקום שעמד, רחץ ידיו רגליו, טבל עליו ונסתפק. בא ממקום שהוא בא והלך למקום שהלך, פשט בגדי החול, לבש בגדי לבן, וכך היה אומר אנא השם, כפר לחטאים, לעוונות ולפשעים שחטאתי לפניך אני וביתי. ואם אדם היה יכול לזכור את הפגמים, את החסרונות, את כל הפשעים, את כל העוונות, בטח כך היה מונה אחת, אחת ואחת, אחת ושתיים, 1 ו3, 1 ו4, 1 ו5. ישר היה מתייאש, כי לא יכול היה לשאת את המרירות החטא, את הבושה, את הפספוס, את ההפסד. והכהנים והעם העומדים בעזרה, כשהיו שומעים את שם השם המפורש יוצא מפי, כהן גדול היו קוראים, משתחווים ונופלים על פניהם. ברוך שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד. פסע למקום שפסע, פניו לקודש אחוריו להיכל, ללא רבב היו שווים פיו ומעשיו. בא ממקום שהוא בא והלך למקום שהלך, פשט בגדי לבן, לבש בגדי זהב, וכך היה אומר אנא השם, כפר לחטאים, לעוונות ולפשעים שחטאתי לפניך אני וביתי. ואם אדם היה יכול לזכור את החסדים, את הטובות, את כל הרחמים, את כל הישועות, בטח כך היה מונה 1, 1 ו1, 1 ו2, 1 מ1000 אלפי אלפים ורוב ריבי רבבות, ניסים נפלאות שעשית עמנו ימים ולילות. והכהנים והעם העומדים בעזרה, כשהיו שומעים את שם השם המפורש יוצא מפי, כהן גדול היו קוראים, משתחווים ונופלים על פניהם. ברוך שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד. יצא ממקום שיצא ורעד במקום שעמד, פשט בגדי זהב, לבש בגדי עצמו, וכל העם והכהנים היו מלווים אותו לביתו, ויום טוב לאוהביו, כי נסלח לכל עדת ישראל. אשרי העם שככה לו, אשרי העם שהשם אלוקיו, אשרי העם שככה לו, אשרי העם שהשם אלוקיו, אשרי העם כאוהל הנמתח בדרם הים הרב שואל, כברקים היוצאים מזיו החיות מראה שואל, דמות הקשב בתוך הענן מראה כהן, כחסד הניתן על פני חתן מראה כהן. וכהנים והעם העומדים בעזרה, כשהיו שומעים את שם השם המפורש יוצא מפי, כהן גדול היו קוראים, משתחווים ונופלים על פניהם. ברוך שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד.
Okay, there is simply so much to unpack, and I'm not quite sure how to go about attacking this. In retrospect, we probably should have designated 2, 3, maybe even 4 shiurim to really give this song the time that it deserves. I think it's very different than the other ones that we've analyzed together, because besides the depth and the complexity of this song, it actually tells a very accurate narrative. It's definitely not complete, and needless to say, there are many, many details of the Avodas Yom Kippurim that are outlined by Chazal, which are missing. But that being said, virtually all of the references here come straight from Chazal. In some cases, literally verbatim, word for word. It's not quite the same thing, but it reminds me how when we say the kinos on Tisha B'Av, the kinos, which are very poetic and original compositions, express the emotion of Jewish suffering, historical tragedy, but they're not necessarily historically accurate. And then there are some exceptions. There are few kinos that are actually used to study and to cross-reference, again, whatever historical records we have. And this particular song, besides the fact that obviously there's a tremendous amount of creative input that the composer, Yishai Ribo, has put into this composition, which makes it incredibly special and unique. But at the same time, it is really, really important that if we are going to analyze this song, we do it properly, which really would mean that we would take out a Mishnayos for starters, and we would take out Chumash and study Parshas Achrimos, and then study Mishnayos, and then various Mamari Chazal, which would really, really give so much more perspective when we look at this song. And so, therefore, since I don't really think that we can do that because the time doesn't allow for that this evening, I'm going to do things differently. And I'm going to touch on themes only tonight. And I would have liked to review the lyrics and to really break it down, but that's not going to happen tonight. For this, I apologize. And again, I'm hoping that we can still accomplish a lot together. But for those who came for a play-by-play summary, I apologize from the outset because you may be disappointed. So what are we going to do? What I'd like to do is, as we've done in the past weeks, focus on the themes of this song. And of course, there are many. I'm going to touch on a few. The first one is the music. One does not have to have a degree in musical theory or music and comprehension, which I don't, to sense that there's a very incredible story that the melody of this song tells. Obviously, the words to this song are very important, essential components to the narrative, but the music is so integral to the message which is so powerfully conveyed. Many of us, perhaps without even taking the time to really ask ourselves, what is happening over here? Why is this song touching me so deeply? May not have noticed and realized and appreciated the change in the tone, the style. It goes from slow to fast, low to high. There are messages of worry and concern, and then hope. There's tension and there's drama. We reach into the depths of the spiritual abyss in the song, and then we climb to the apex of spiritual ecstasy. It's all contained within the song, and the music brings a lot of that out. I want you to note, and if no pun intended over there, that some of the notes in this song are in a minor key and some are in a major key. And you should also appreciate that this is a style and a theme which is consistent with the entire nusach of Yamim Noraim. Yishai Ribo has tapped into this, I think, in a most inspiring and creative way. I'll give an example. I am far from an expert, or even, I forget, I'm not an expert. I don't know anything about the nusach of Yamim Noraim. But I'll just point out a couple of things that we all know, but I'm not sure how many people appreciate this. So, for example, there are several unique tunes that we use for the Kaddish on the Yamim Noraim. So I'll give you an example. Yiskadal v'yiskada shemei Rabbah. Now that rendition, which wasn't so great, my apologies, is in a major key, right? So it's a very sort of uplifting, it is a cheerful, it is hopeful, sort of a positive message behind that tone. But compare that to the following. Yiskadal shemei Rabbah. Now, I know you're all familiar with both of those sounds and both of those tunes, but did you note the difference? And if you're paying attention on Yom Kippur, play pay close attention as to when we use which Kaddish and why it is so important that when it comes to certain parts of the Nusach, on the Yom and the Roim, we not play with them, we not tinker. Maybe there's the possibility of introducing our own tunes, songs that we like, but we have to be very careful when we do that. So, for example, there's a very, very popular song. Actually, Yishai Ribo, it's not his song, but he does sing it to Ochila, which was popularized in Israel at some point over the last 10 years. And people all over were singing. It's very nice. But actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think the Maharil brings down that the traditional tune that we have for Ochila, that is a tune that we may not change in Shul, because the tune itself conveys a very, very important message. There are some very, very critical themes and essential ideas that are communicated through the song and through the music. And I think one of the things that makes this particular song very, very powerful is that I think it's really unique, because this is an area, I think, strength of Yishai Ribo as a composer of music, who has been able to create a very, very beautiful synergy between the words and the music. But in this song in particular, he is really, really able to reveal, to tap into the spring of what is happening over here, specifically by the way he denotes the song at different points in this song. So that's the first theme that I want to highlight as we consider this together. Now, I want to talk about the footsteps of the Kohen Gadol. I think I entitled tonight's shiur, Following the Footsteps of the Kohen Gadol. Now, that was deliberate on my part. I didn't want to say following in the footsteps of the Kohen Gadol, which perhaps we can and should do as well. But that wasn't really my point. When I hear this song, I feel like I am following the Kohen Gadol, as if I am escorting him. And for myself personally, the song opened my mind and my heart to appreciate the experience of the Kohen Gadol and the entire experience of the Avodah in a way that I had never had before. And I say that not matter-of-factly. It was surprising to me when I stood in Shul on Yom Kippur 2 years ago, maybe a week or two after having heard this song for the first time, and I was surprised myself as to how much that experience was enhanced by the song. But that's exactly what it did for me. Now, many of us may have wondered in the past, why is such an important day, a day of Yom Kippurim, essentially completely delegated to one individual? Why is it that the Kohen Gadol plays such a central role, and everyone else, even the Kohanim, but certainly the majority of Klal Yisrael, just standing by, literally just bystanders? How could that be? Now, perhaps the question is better than any answer I can give, but through this song, I came to see things from a different perspective, that the Kohen Gadol is not merely a representative, but someone who could be, and to a certain extent is, each and every one of us. There is a personal avoda to the day of Yom Kippurim, and we're supposed to realize that through the avoda of the Kohen Gadol. Of course, we need to try to achieve a certain balance when we are in Shul. Last year, I recall there were numerous people who were unable to come to Shul on Yom Kippur, some of them by choice and some just by circumstance, people who had tested positive or had to quarantine. And on a certain level, this was profoundly disappointing and maybe even devastating to certain individuals. I know some very chashiv rabbanim who were unable to go to Shul last year. I spoke to one of them last year, right before Yom Tov. I tried to give him the chum. I said, I would do anything to trade places with you, so you could be in Shul and I could be at home. But at the same time, some of these people were able to recognize that there was a certain intimacy that they were able to achieve and experience in the tefillos on Yom Kippur that they had never been able to access before. Ideally, this is something that we should be able to integrate and incorporate even when we are in Shul. But I think that this song, in describing the very personal, the very private, the very intimate experience of the Kohen Gadol who is alone in the Kodesh Kodashim, reveals to us the possibility that each and every one of us can sort of enter a similar place and space. I once heard, I don't know if I've ever seen this in writing, but I've heard an idea in the name of Rav Soloveitchik that I'd like to share with you. And that is, yet when we consider the Mikdash, there are different places, there are different parts to the Mikdash, there are many different chambers and rooms, but there are essentially three major locations, if you will. The first one is what we call the Azara, the outer courtyard. And then there is the Heichal, the Kodesh, which is the main sanctuary, if you will, of the Mishkan, of the Mikdash. And then inside, right beyond the Kodesh, beyond the Heichal, we come into what we call the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh Kodashim, an area which is off limits to all people all throughout the year, with the exception of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim. So you have these three areas: the Azara, the Heichal, and the Kodesh Kodashim. So the Azara is open not all times and not to anyone, but basically it's a public area. Person has to be tahor. Not everyone can go there at all times, but it's basically an area which is open to, we'll call it the public. The Heichal, the Kodesh, is not open to the public. Only a Kohen can go there, and they don't go there to just hang out. It's a place where you go with very, very specific aspects and features of the worship of the avodah that happen on a daily basis in the Mikdash. And then, as I mentioned, the Kodesh Kodashim, the innermost chamber, this is off limits to everyone with the exception of the Kohen Gadol. So the Rav shared the following idea, and that is that each and every one of us have within inside of ourselves these three domains as well. We have an Azara. The Azara, if you will, is the part of myself that I share with everyone. Each and every one of you know my Azara. I'm showing you my Azara right now. I'm comfortable in such a public setting, sharing parts of myself, and this is the place and the space in which we interact with one another freely and regularly. And then we all have an area inside of ourselves that is our Heichal, an area which is Kodesh, an area which we don't just open to anyone. I wouldn't share my innermost secrets with just anyone. I would want to know that you're a close confidant, that you're somebody that I can trust, maybe a close friend. There are very, very few people that I will invite into my Kodesh. And so it is with everyone. And then, said the Rav, each and every one of us have a Kodesh HaKadoshim. We have the innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies. And this is a place which is off limits to everyone except me. And some of us only enter that Kodesh HaKadoshim once a year on Yom Kippurim. I'm not sure, and I don't know if the Rav said that that's an ideal. Perhaps there's benefit in visiting our Kodesh HaKadoshim more often than once a year. But at least, if there is one day of the year in which we can strive to enter that very, very deep sanctuary within inside of ourselves, a very personal place, a place which we can tap into something which is pure, something which is unaffected by chet. Elokai neshama shenasatabi tahora he, not tahora hayasa, not that it was pure when you endowed me with the Spirit, but it remains pure at this time. So to me, this song, in which we are able to track and to follow the Kohen Gadol into the Kodesh HaKodashim, reminded me of how important it is for us to come in contact, if you will, in touch with our own Kodesh HaKodashim. The next theme that I'd like to touch upon is a theme of clothing, which is clearly a very prominent theme in this song. Now, I'm not going to pull the lyrics back up, but I'm sure if you were paying attention, and I have to imagine that most of you have heard this song before, and if not, I'm sure you'll be listening to it again and again. By the way, I've never ever gotten bored of this song. I don't know how many times I've listened to it in the background, but it's just hasn't grown old on me yet. So Yishai Ribo mentions actually three, but I will say four different types of articles of clothing. Three, but he uses four terms. The first is not necessarily in this order, but the Big Day Zahav, the golden clothing, the golden vestments that the Kohen Gadol wears when he performs the avoda in the Mikdash. Then there are the Big Day Lavan, literally the white clothing that he wears when he goes into the Kodesh HaKodashim, again, only once a year on Yom Kippurim. And then he has a term that he uses, Big Day Chol or Big Day Atzmo. His, we'll call like weekday clothing, his clothing, his personal clothing that don't have any particular kedusha. Those are the three types of outfits, if you will, the wardrobes that the Kohen Gadol wears. Now, I think there's a lot of symbolic meaning to unpack over here. Obviously, Yishai Ribo was not the first one to introduce the concept of clothing as far as it pertains to the Kohen Gadol as it relates to the Avodah and Yom Kippur. The Torah highlights the importance of the Kohen being very mindful, in particular, about the clothing that he wears at different parts, and he's literally changing his clothing throughout the day, on and off, one to the other, one to the other. So that is there. But the way it is highlighted and featured in the song, at least for myself, really forced me to consider, to stop for a moment to say, what does clothing mean? What does clothing mean in general? Why do we wear clothing? When did we start wearing clothing? We know that, right? We know that Adam and Chava were created in Gan Eden without clothing. And as far as we can tell, Kodem Achet, before the sin in Gan Eden, that was completely natural and normal, and nothing seemed unusual to anyone. And it was only after La'achar Achet that they recognized that they were Arumim, and it's hard to really understand what this means, and we're not going to devote ourselves to this right now, but we have to understand and appreciate that clothing has a lot of important symbolic significance. The Torah tells us, Vayas Hashem Elokim la'adam ilu ishto kosnos or vayabishem. He gave them kosnos or. Or is spelled with an ayin, which means skins. He gave them skins that they could place over their body, so that they should be covered and they shouldn't be completely naked. But the Medrash in Bereishis Rabbah Parsha Chaf tells us, "B'toraso sheremeir matzo kasav kosnos or" with an aleph. And Rav Hirsch, in his commentary on Parshas Bereishis, tries to delve into this and what that means. And he basically says, you have to take a look for yourself, but clothing has the possibility to cover and also to illuminate, or with an ayin and or with an aleph, a very, very fascinating, intriguing idea. There is really a lot to talk about when it comes to clothing. And when we think about clothing as well, clothing is something which creates a separation between us and anything around us. So on the one hand, it could serve to sort of protect us, but it is also, in certain cases, Chazal use the concept of a beged as a metaphor for sin. There's a term that is found in many of the Sifrei Kabbalah, of which I'm not really familiar and qualified to really comment on at all, but the idea of klipos, of there being sort of these shells, these external covers, which separate us between us and usually whatever it is that the source of Kedusha in our lives, God. So the idea of begadim and what begadim do and what they represent is very, very important. Now, the Sefer HaChinuch, in his commentary on the concept of Bigdei Kahuna, specifically the clothing that the Kohen Gadol wears, so he writes, I want to read this to you. Misharshi HaMitzvah. He says that at the root of this mitzvah, Hayasod HaKavua Lanu Ki Adam Nifa Lafi Pu'ulosav, that a person will essentially operate and function based on his actions, meaning the way we act, what we do physically impacts the way we think, the way we feel. A person's kavanos, intentions, a person's thoughts and values, they sort of evolve around the way a person acts. This is a very, very important guiding principle through the writings of the Sefer HaChinuch, who on numerous occasions tells us that the Torah tells us to do something because the Torah wants us to feel something. The Torah tells us to act a certain way because acharei hapu'ulos nimshachim alavavos, that when we act a certain way, so then our heart will follow. Says the Sefer HaChinuch, v'hashaliach, the messenger, namely the Kohen Gadol, hamachaper, who is going to facilitate the atonement for Klal Yisrael, tzorich lehatfis kol machshavto v'kamanaso el avoda. He has to focus himself on the avoda. This is such an important day, not just for him personally, for all of Klal Yisrael. He has to wear clothing that is fit and that is designated for this purpose. Because when he sees this, he will remember before whom he is standing and serving, and what his purpose is and what his function is right now. In other words, we have different modes of avodas Hashem. The idea of the Bigdei Lavan, the Bigdei Zahav, of course, there's lots to be said on that alone, but we have there's a time and there's a place for everything. And this is an idea that obviously relates to Yom Kippur, but I do think it really relates to us far beyond that. And there's another point that I'd like to mention before we move on from clothing, and that is that, and Yishai Ribo touches upon this as well, and that is that when he changes from the Bigdei Lavan to the Bigdei Zavan, the Bigdei Zavan, Bigdei Lavan, so the Kohen Gadol goes to the mikvah in between. When he changes his clothing, he goes to the mikvah. What is the purpose of going to the mikvah? So as we know, mikvah is a place where a person goes to be mataher themselves, to purify themselves. So Rav In the Sefer LaTorah V'Lamoadim, he asks an interesting question. He says, I understand why when the Kohen Gadol changes from his Big Day Zahav, the golden clothing, in order to put on the Big Day Lovin, it makes perfect sense that he should go to the mikveh, because he is going from a lower level of Kedusha to a higher level of Kedusha, right? He is working, first he is operating, functioning outside of the Kodesh Kodashim, and then he changes the clothing to the Big Day Lovin to enter the Holy of Holies. So it makes perfect sense that when making such a transition, the Kohen Gadol should first go to the mikveh. But ask Reb Zevin, why is it that when the Kohen Gadol exits the Kodesh Kodashim, when he leaves the Holy of Holies, and he removes his Big Day Lovin in order to put on the Big Day Zav, he still goes to the mikveh? Why is he going to the mikveh? He's going from a higher level to a lower level. You don't have to be matahir yourself in such a situation. And Reb Zevin gives a very profound answer, an answer which I think is more relevant for the day after Yom Kippur, but I'll share it right now. And that is that he says we should never think that the Ikar Avoda, that the primary place where we serve God is in the Kodesh Kodashim, and when we leave the Kodesh Kodashim, okay, so now it's not really all that important. He says no. He says that the Avodas HaChutz, the Avoda that takes place outside of the Kodesh Kodashim, that is the Ikar Avoda. And so therefore, there's sort of a paradox over here. On the one hand, the Kodesh Kodashim is such a special place. It is this spiritually sterile environment where a human being can only enter once a year, and there's something which is truly awesome and very transcendent about that moment. It is a very, very, very climactic moment for the entire Jewish people. And you would think, therefore, that that's it. It doesn't get better than that. And Rav Zevin is basically telling us, no, the Torah says, and when you leave the Kodesh Kodashim and you're about to go back into your, your weekday clothes, your everyday clothes, you're about to resume your normal life, go to the mikveh again, because you are now to prepare for that which is maybe on a certain level, a higher level of service, serving God where it's not the Kodesh Kodashim, which on a certain level, we'll say conceptually, may be easier. But, I just saw it today. Somebody sent me something very clever. He says, as important it is to be on your best behavior from the days in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it's even more important to be on your best behavior from the days in between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, right? That's the point. That's the point. Yeah, of course it's true. We have to really, really, really try to be the best that we can during the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. And then what? And then when we leave Yom Kippur and we go into the regular, mundane days of our lives, and then we just, what? We just change our clothing and get on with it? No. We go to the mikvah, we change our clothing deliberately, thoughtfully, and we prepare ourselves for the next stage of our Avodas Hashem. Okay, the next theme, which I'm sure, again, for anybody who's listening to this song with me, you must be moved by this in the same way. I don't feel like I'm sharing anything over here, which is, what a chiddush, this is so insightful. If you've heard the song, if you've learned the song, if you've allowed it to touch you, this has touched you. And I think that this actually is, to a certain extent, a very, very important contribution of the composer himself. I'm not saying that the idea doesn't exist elsewhere, but it's certainly not obvious on the surface and maybe even beneath the surface. Too often we relate to vidui from a perspective of dread and terror. We become overwhelmed by the sadness, and we can find ourselves drowning in guilt with the Asham news and the Bagad news. What do? We stand in shul and we bend over, and in a very broken state of mind, and literally in this position which is submissive, in which we stand almost as if we're about to fall over. We say Hashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, Zibanidofi. But yet, on the day of Yom Kippurim, as we know, when we gather together in shul, and the tzibur is saying the Hashamnu together, there's a beautiful custom which may seem a little strange and a little awkward on the surface, but we sing that together. And remember what I said before in terms of paying attention to whether the note is sort of a cheerful one or a depressing one, a major tune, a minor tune. Ay, 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 Hashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, Dibarnu, Dofi. Now, again, you may hear something and I may hear something else. But to me, there is a cheerful, hopeful, positive tone in that melody. And on the day of Yom Kippurim, we are enveloped by the supreme rachamim of Hashem. And that is truly amazing. And when Yishai Ribo goes ahead and he walks us through the avoda. And as we sprinkle, as the Kohen Gadol sprinkles the blood on the, and he counts the way we do. Achas v'achas, achas v'shtayim, achas v'shalosh. So, of course, recounting on a certain level the sins and pointing out all of our inadequacies and confessing all that we've done wrong, our sins, our shortcomings. But at the same time, he goes back and he repeats those very same words, achas v'achas, and remembering kol chasadim, and all the tovos and all the yeshuos and the nechamas, all the wonderful things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done for us. And on a certain level, the wonderful things that we have done. Because we recognize on Yom Kippur not only our failures and our shortcomings, but we recognize our potential. We recognize our contributions. We recognize that, there is something there. And again, to me, I think this is one of the most impactful and one of the most inspiring messages of this entire song. And that is that there has to be a balance. There has to be a balance. Of course, Yom Kippur is a day in which we, on a certain level, break ourselves down. We break ourselves down. But it is also, as the Mishnah in Tanis tells us, Lo hayu yamim tovim Yisrael. It is one of the greatest days of the entire year. Yom Kippur is a fantastic day. It is a fabulous day. It is a day of rejuvenation, of spiritual rejuvenation. It's a day of connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it comes about because we realize we count and then we cannot count. As he says, we literally do not have the ability to count all of the chasadim, the tovos and the yeshuos that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does for us. The next theme in the song that I would like to touch upon is the idea that I will say that tshuva is from within. Now, I think part of what, perhaps I may be wrong, confuses us sometimes with the avoda is the impression that it is all about ritual and regimented action, and it is scripted and is choreographed down to the smallest details. And while there is undoubtedly something very inspiring about that in of itself, it does perhaps leave us at times with the impression that the avoda was lacking in terms of spirit and soul and the emotional experience for the active participants and the bystanders. I will comment, by the way, I, as my father and grandfather did, I daven Nusach Ashkenaz. And I imagine, I could be wrong, that many of those who are listening right now also follow the similar Nusach. That's what we use in our shul in Beth Aaron and many shuls. You daven Nusach Ashkenaz. When I was in yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael in Kerem B'Yavneh, so there they daven Nusach Sfard. So even though, that was not my particular nusach. If you want to be, part of the service, if you want to, get with the program, so to speak, you have to follow the same script. So in our private Shemona Esreis, certain parts of the davening, we remained faithful to our own nusach. But when the avoda was being read, and it was a communal experience. So, we use Nusach Sfard. We were given instructions before Yom Kippur. Make sure, no matter what your Nusach is back home, if you want to be prepared in yeshiva, you have to have a machzor Nusach Sfard. So I have a machzor in my office right now, Nusach Sfard, because of the time that I used it in yeshiva. Anybody here who is familiar with Nusach Sfard knows that the Nusach Sfard version of the avoda is actually a lot more accessible to someone who is not as familiar with the particulars. And actually, I would go farther than that. It's more accessible to anyone, because the avoda, the way it is written in Nusach Ashkenaz, although some of the details are the same, it is written in a very, very poetic form. So every phrase is very cryptic and has to be broken down. It's beautiful, but it would take hours and hours and hours really breaking it down phrase by phrase, and using, the proper tools to be able to really, really understand what's going on over here. Where are we in the story? Nusach Sfard is a lot more accessible. It actually reads more like a story. And I remember at the time being, it was enlightening. It was, and it's really unusual, because usually when you're davening a different nusach, usually you feel like a stranger. Oh my God, what's going on over here? I don't recognize anything. Where am I? I feel lost. At this particular moment in my life, I actually, for the first time, I felt, oh, wow, this is pretty interesting. I did not feel lost when I was saying the avoda together with Achenu B'nai Sfard for the first time. But anyway, the avoda of Yom Kippur is something which is very, very regimented, and it is scripted, and it is very technical. And there are many, many, many details, many details. And this song, without necessarily explaining how and why, enables each and every one of us to appreciate that ritual and halachic details need not preclude us from achieving an emotional experience. There is something very, very emotionally powerful about this song. It's palpable. You can't hear the song and not be touched by it in a very, very deep and profound way. And how does that come about? Through a story which is very technical, very detailed. I don't want to call it boring, but something that's, besides being very difficult to relate to, it doesn't seem on the surface to be all that inspiring. But what you see from this, again, in the composers, I think in his creative genius, has enabled us to see something that others have seen. And it was not a chiddush to the Rav. I want to read to you for a moment. I'm reading from the book, The Rav, which is a collection of quotes and citations from Rav Soloveitchik. So this comes from an article that was published in 1960. And the Rav wrote, "There is much that I have studied and taught about the days of judgment and mercy, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I discussed the concept of these days with my late father, who was my teacher. I have often lectured on the halachic, agadic, and philosophical nature of these special days to my congregants, students, and colleagues. I also possess many manuscripts which I have written on all these themes. Nevertheless, my true understanding of these days is shaped by my childhood experiences, which I must constantly recall from the distant past. My joyful spirit is revived when these memories once again become tangible. Only then can I supplicate the Almighty and pour out my uneasy soul to Him. At that moment, I feel that the presence of God hovers over me in the image of the pleasurable smile of a beloved mother. When I once again visualize my late father sitting and studying on Yom Kippur night, then I feel the true meaning of this sacred day. My father studied in his intimate and modest fashion the laws pertaining to the sacrificial service of Yom Kippur. That's what we're discussing, the Avodas Yom Kippurim. He chanted the text to a tune which was both melancholy and joyful. When these sounds pierce my consciousness from the distant past, I am overcome with intense yearnings for that faraway world of my innocent childhood, which is so different from my present tainted one. My love is awakened and my spirit is sparked. And only then am I inspired to recite from the depths of my being the blessing of the sanctity of the day." Another quote, if you'll allow me, from the Rav. This comes from a Tshuva Drush in 1970. "Here I am, sitting in my classroom, trying to explain the concepts of Yom Kippur to my students. We learn about the Machzor with its liturgical poems and about the laws and customs pertaining to the Yom Noraim. If there is a need, I also give them philosophical explanations. From an intellectual point of view, there is much that I can transmit to my students from what I received from my forefathers and mentors about the significance of this day and about the sanctities of the days of awe. What I cannot give them, however, are my personal emotional experiences that I've experienced on these days. I cannot lift them into the world of emotion that a Jew has to feel when he says the Zechronos on Yom Kippur. How can I, on Rosh Hashanah, how can I transmit to them the feelings that I felt when I heard my grandfather Reb Chaim recite the prayer after the description of the temple service with such emotion and fear?" And he quotes over here in English, "All this took place when the sanctuary was firmly established. The high priest ministered, and his generation watched and rejoiced." And concludes the Rav, "You can tangibly feel that at that moment Reb Chaim was in a totally different world, as if he had left Brisk and had been transported back to Yerushalayim of thousands of years ago. This experience of feeling the emotion of the sanctity of the day is lacking for American Jewry." So I share this with you because I don't want to suggest that Yishai Riba was the first one who discovered that there is a tremendous amount of emotion that can be discovered in the Avodas Yom Kippurim, but he certainly deserves a tremendous amount of credit for bringing it back to our attention and to our awareness and consciousness. And I would say for facilitating, for enabling people who perhaps would not have been able to achieve that sense of inspiration. And to a certain extent, myself as well. You know, I feel a little comforted. Somebody shared with me a quote from Rav Moshe Weinberger from Eish Kodesh in Woodmere, who said, "How can one listen to the song and ever think of the Avodah the same way again?" I mean, I felt felt good hearing that from an Adam Gadol like Weinberger. How could you listen to the song and not, and not permanently change the way you relate to this? So I do really think that this song reminds us that tshuva comes from within. It's not only from without. It's not only about the practice. And I'll just mention one other thing. There's in halacha, when we think about a mitzvah, very often we think about, how do I do a mitzvah, or at which point am I mekayim a mitzvah? So when it comes to most mitzvahs, the action of the mitzvah constitutes what we call the kiyum mitzvah, the fulfillment of the mitzvah. We don't separate the two. So Mitzvah Hashem, another week, we're going to be celebrating Sukkot. When a person takes a lulav and you take the dalid minim, says the Gemara, mid'agbe nafakbe, when you lift it up, so you fulfill the mitzvah of netilas lulav. So what was the action? Lifting it, holding it. And what was the fulfillment? Lifting it, holding it. It's the same thing. The Rav suggested that when it comes to some mitzvos, a few important mitzvos, the action is one part of the mitzvah, but the kiyum mitzvah is separate. The kiyum is what the Rav called as a kiyum shebelev. So one example is when it comes to tefillah. There are actions associated with tefillah. There's a script that we follow. There are rules about when we daven and how we daven and where we daven and what we can do and what we can say and when we can't. There are so many technicalities, but ultimately, as the Torah says, tefillah is an avodah shebelev. It's an avodah shebelev. It's something which the kiyum is belev. The Rav said the same is true when it comes to the mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov, and it's true when it comes to Avelos. And the Rav said it's true when it comes to the mitzvah of Tshuva. There are actions associated with Tshuva. The actions that we are familiar with, we would think about, let's say about Vidui. Vidui is an action. It's an action. I stand there, I say things, right? We clap al chet. There's an action associated with it. However, ultimately, Tshuva, repentance, is one which is from within. It's an avodah shebelev. The avodas Yom Kippurim is an action-oriented experience. It's so much about what is being done, and again, it is very, very, very. It is choreographed and regulated down to the finest details. However, ultimately, the experience and the fulfillment of that entire experience is something which is, to a large extent, believe. And that is something, like I said, which also I think comes through very strongly from this song. And finally, I would say the triumphant joy. Going back to the first point that I mentioned about the music of this song, the song brings us through the different stages and phases, up and down and up and down. We literally fall into the abyss, and then we climb to the top of the mountain. But the song clearly ends in a very, very triumphant way and describes the joy that not only the Kohen Gadol felt, but everyone who was there to be able to see the Kohen Gadol, Yotzei, who would leave the Kodesh Kodashim, and of course many in our shuls we sing what has become already a very popular song, Amari Kohen, but the way, again, Yishai Riba was successful in sharing a new niggin, a new tune to those very, very same words, Ashrei Ha'am Shekachalo, Ashrei Ha'am Sheshem Elokov, very, very powerful. In the Machzor, Mesoras Harav for Yom Kippur, again, the final thing I want to share with you tonight. So in the introduction, there are several very, very meaningful essays in this introduction, and there's an introductory essay over here called the Rav Ish Yom HaKippurim. And it's worthwhile to read it, several pages, but it describes how the Rav personified Yom Kippur all throughout the year, not only on Yom Kippur, but all throughout the year. But there's something I want to share with you. It says over here, he writes in the Ish Halacha that as a young boy, he stood in the courtyard of the shul in Kaslovich with his father, Rav Moshe, on Yom Kippur. And as the sun was setting and the horizon was ablaze, Rav Moshe turned to his son and said, "This is the most beautiful sunset of the year, for it is mechaper. It atones for Klal Yisrael, because atonement comes at the end of the day." Even nature was interpreted through the penetrating lens of the halacha. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein once related that if you ever wanted a favor from the Rav, you should ask him after Ne'ilah, because he would be in such a good mood. I once davened with the Rav on Yom Kippur in Boston. You sense that the Rav, as he said Slichos, was reconnected to the first Yom Kippur when the 13 attributes of mercy were first revealed to Moshe. Hashem, Hashem, Kol Rachum V'Chanan. There was a triumphant joy that was evident on the face of the Rav. The Rav's daughter told me that after Yom Kippur, the Rav would be in such an ecstatic state, often singing the Nigunim of Negi'ila, that he would be unable to eat for hours. Kidmus hakeshes besoche anan, like the multicolored splendor of the rainbow, dazzling and inspiring the reflection of the Shekhinah herself. This was how the image of the Kohen Gadol of the Rav. So I think, in conclusion, what this song I think does very, very effectively is it enables us to sort of taste that a little bit. There's a great sense of triumph at the end of the song. There's a feeling that, we really, really accomplished something. There was something truly remarkable, miraculous about this experience that we just went through together, that we tasted a little bit of the Avodas Yom Kippurim. So these are some of my thoughts. I hope that you found them meaningful. Again, my sincere apologies to those who would have really, really preferred spending the time taking apart the song line by line, layer by layer. Forgive me for two reasons. Number one, it's been a busy week, so I didn't necessarily have the time to do that. But when I started to do that, I realized, oh boy, this is not going to take 45 minutes or an hour. This will take several hours. And I think for that reason alone, it deserves that sort of attention for another time. So, Be'ez Hashem, one time we'll come back to the song and we will give it adequate attention to really, really take it apart layer by layer. For the time being, I hope that the song, together with my thoughts and perspectives at some of the most important themes from the song, will help inspire us and give us a little more food for thought as we enter into the final days before Yom Kippurim. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you next week, Be'ez Hashem, after Yom Kippur, a couple days before Sukkot, as we are going to review together the song Mashgiach Min HaChalonot. And I will try my best, even though it's a song which I don't think is about Sukkot, we're going to try to apply it to the best of our abilities to the Yom Tif of Sukkot. Wishing you all a wonderful night and a Gemar Chasima Tova.